Silver bullets never lie. They find their mark just as surely as the past finds those who try to outrun it. The Colorado mountains hold two treasures beneath their rugged peaks, gold veins that make men rich and buried secrets that keep them haunted. Both kill with equal efficiency when disturbed. In these territories, justice wears many faces. Sometimes it's a badge gleaming in sunlight. Sometimes it's twin colts with pearl grips emerging from shadow. And sometimes it's a widow's calm smile hiding steel beneath silk. They say you can bury a life, but not the person who lived it. That even the gentlest hands remember the weight of a gun. The ghosts don't always walk through walls. Sometimes they simply wait patient as winter for the moment when silence must finally break. And when it does break, it will not whisper. The ledger before Eleanor Sawyer told a story of dwindling resources and mounting debt. Numbers arranged in neat columns revealed the slow death of Whispering Creek Mine, a death that had begun 2 years ago when they'd pulled Samuel's broken body from the collapsed lower shaft. She removed her wire-rimmed spectacles, pinching the bridge of her nose, where they'd left small indentations in her skin. The lamp beside her cast warm light across the cabin, creating the illusion of comfort in a space that felt increasingly like a mausoleum for dreams long dead. "Mrs. Sawyer." A soft knock accompanied the voice of Rodrigo Vega, her foreman. "May I come in?" "Enter," she said quickly, replacing her spectacles and closing the ledger. Rodrigo stepped inside, removing his hat. Dust from the mines clung to his clothing and darkened the creases of his weathered face. At 53, he'd seen the rise and fall of a dozen mining operations across the Colorado Territory. Yet his loyalty to Whispering Creek, to Samuel's vision, and now to Eleanor remained unshakable. The Collins brothers left this morning. He reported, his accent thickening with fatigue. "That makes 7 men gone this month." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Did they collect their pay?" "See. They asked me to thank you for the extra day's wages." Rodrigo hesitated. "Senora, we must consider what options remain. Without more men, we continue." Eleanor interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "I know the situation appears dire, Rodrigo, but we're not abandoning Whispering Creek." The foreman studied her with dark, concerned eyes. "Even Samuel, with all his knowledge, could not make the eastern vein profitable. Perhaps it is time to consider Sentinel's offer." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Pioneer Gold can make all the offers they wish. This mine is not for sale." She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the ramshackle collection of buildings that constituted the mining operation. In the fading evening light, Whispering Creek looked peaceful, almost beautiful, the weathered wooden structures softened by golden sunlight, the rutted paths between them empty now as the day shift workers settled in the bunkhouse for supper. "There's news," Rodrigo said, carefully watching her. "Sheriff Holden rode through Copper Springs yesterday. The Black Wolves gang has been spotted near Miller's Crossing." Eleanor turned, her face carefully composed. "Miller's Crossing is 30 miles south. Cattle rustlers don't limit themselves to one area, Senora." Rodrigo's eyes narrowed slightly. "And word travels when a mining operation is struggling." She returned to her desk, methodically organizing papers that were already neatly arranged. "Thank you for the information, Rodrigo. Please ask Mrs. Wilson to double the night watch rotation." After Rodrigo departed, Eleanor remained motionless, staring at the closed door. The Black Wolves, a name she'd begun hearing with increasing frequency over the past year. Led by a man called Victor Blackwood, they'd established themselves as one of the most ruthless gangs in the territory, moving from cattle rustling to more ambitious targets. "Blackwood," she whispered, testing the name in the empty room. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear despite the years. A courthouse in Denver 7 years ago. A man called Liam Blackwood standing trial for the brutal murder of a family father, mother, and young daughter slaughtered for the deed to their ranch. The courtroom packed with onlookers, the air thick with tension, and herself seated in the back row, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, listening as the judge pronounced the sentence, death by hanging. She'd tracked Liam Blackwood for 3 weeks through the harshest terrain Colorado could offer. Found him half drunk in a mining camp near the Wyoming border. Put 2 silver bullets in his chest when he'd drawn on her. The silver wasn't necessary. Lead would have done the job just as well, but it had become her signature. The calling card of the ghost, the bounty hunter who materialized like mist at dawn or dusk and left only corpses in her wake. That life seemed a century distant now, belonging to a different woman entirely. A woman who'd existed before Samuel Sawyer had walked into the saloon in Silverton with his gentle eyes and quiet intensity, before he'd looked at her and somehow seen past the practiced coldness to the person beneath. Eleanor moved to the far corner of the cabin, kneeling beside the bed. From beneath it, she pulled a leather trunk, small but heavy, secured with a brass lock. The key hung around her neck, hidden beneath her high-collared blouse, along with her wedding band. Two medals, two lives pressed against her skin. She didn't open the trunk. Not tonight. Instead, she ran her fingers over the worn leather, feeling the contours of what lay inside. The twin Colts with pearl grips, the ammunition belt with loops for silver bullets, the tarnished tin star that had never been official but had become legend throughout 3 territories. Not tonight, she whispered, pushing the trunk back into its hiding place. For 6 years, too, while Samuel lived, and 4 since his death, she'd kept the trunk locked, both physically and in her mind. Eleanor Sawyer, mine owner's wife, and then widow, had no need for the tools or identity of the ghost. She'd buried that life the day she'd married Samuel, vowed to be the woman he believed she could be. But as she rose and returned to the ledger, a cold certainty settled in her chest. The dwindling resources, the departing workers, the rumors of the Black Wolves moving closer, a storm was gathering around Whispering Creek. And storms had a way of unearthing what had been carefully buried. The following morning brought 3 riders to Whispering Creek, their approach slow and deliberate, as they studied the mining operation from the ridge overlooking the main camp. The tallest of the men, Victor Blackwood, lowered a brass spyglass with a satisfied smile that revealed tobacco-stained teeth beneath an unkempt mustache. "Ain't much to speak of," he muttered, his voice carrying the gravel of decades of hard living and cheap whiskey. "Woman's running it with no more than 15 workers from what I can tell." Wade Turner, the second rider whose face bore the pitted scars of smallpox survived in childhood, squinted against the harsh glare. "You sure about this, Victor? We never hit mining operations before. Cattle's simpler." "And cattle don't pay what gold does," Victor countered. "That widow's sitting on one of the richest veins in the territory, according to our friend on the inside. She just don't know it yet." The third rider, a young man barely 20 named Charlie, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Might be risky. Mining camps have armed men." Victor snorted. "This one's barely holding together. Half the workforce has quit since the husband died. Besides," his eyes narrowed as he studied the distant figure of a woman moving between buildings, "I've got personal reasons for wanting this particular mine." "What kind of reasons?" Charlie asked. Victor didn't answer immediately, instead replacing the spyglass in his saddlebag and adjusting his hat against the morning sun. "Family reasons." He finally said, his tone discouraging further questions. "Now let's ride down friendly-like. Just 3 honest men looking for work." As they approached the main entrance to the mining camp, Victor assessed the operation with the practiced eye of a predator. The protective fence surrounding the property had seen better days, with gaps where boards had fallen away and never been replaced. The guard posted at the entrance, a tired-looking man with a rifle across his knees, appeared half asleep. Signs of neglect were everywhere, tools left to rust, buildings needing repair, a water tank with a slow but steady leak creating a muddy puddle beneath it. The place smelled of desperation and failure. The guard straightened as they approached, his hand moving toward his rifle. "State your business," he called. Victor removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "Name's James Kent. My associates and I are looking for work. Heard Whispering Creek might be hiring." The guard's posture relaxed slightly. "You'd have to speak with Mrs. Sawyer or Mr. Vega about that. Wait here." As the guard turned to send a boy running toward the main office, Victor exchanged a quick glance with Wade. This would be even easier than expected. Eleanor was reviewing course samples when Rodrigo entered her office with news of the visitors. Through the window, she could see 3 men waiting near the entrance, their horses dusty from travel. Something in their positioning, the deliberate spacing between them, the way they constantly scanned their surroundings, sent a prickling sensation down her spine. "Did they give names?" she asked, setting aside the rock samples. "James Kent and Associates," Rodrigo replied. "Looking for work, they claim." Eleanor studied the men more carefully. The leader was tall, with a hard face, weathered by sun and marked by excess. The second man bore distinctive smallpox scars, his stance watchful. The third was notably younger with a nervousness to his movements that suggested inexperience. "I'll speak with them," she decided, rising from her desk. "Have Jackson and Williams stay within sight." She adjusted her spectacles, a habit that had begun as part of her carefully cultivated appearance as the genteel Mrs. Sawyer, but had since become genuine necessity for close work. The transformation from the ghost to mine owner's wife had been methodical, beginning with these spectacles, continuing with the modulation of her voice to something softer, her posture to something less alert, her entire being recalibrated to fade into respectability rather than terrify. Eleanor crossed the yard with measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, aware of the men's evaluating gaze. She stopped at a careful distance, close enough for conversation, but maintaining space that would allow for retreat if necessary. "Gentlemen," she greeted them, "I understand you're seeking employment. I'm Eleanor Sawyer, the owner of Whispering Creek." The tall man touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, appreciate you taking the time. James Kent. These are my associates, Mr. Turner and young Charlie here." He nodded toward the smallpox-scarred man and the younger rider in turn. "We've been prospecting south of here, had some bad luck. Heard Whispering Creek might be taking on experienced men." "I'm afraid your information is outdated, Mr. Kent." Eleanor replied, the lie coming easily. "We're currently reducing operations, not expanding." Kent frowned slightly. "That's not what we heard. Word travels, you know. Talk is you're planning to reopen the lower shaft following a vein your husband was working before his untimely passing." The specificity of the knowledge sent a chill through Eleanor. Their information was too detailed, too current to have been gathered casually. Someone in her operation was feeding information to outsiders, or was one of them. "You seem remarkably well informed about my business affairs," she observed, allowing a hint of steel to enter her tone, "especially for prospectors just passing through." The smallpox-scarred man Turner shifted uneasily at her directness, but Kent merely smiled. "Mining communities talk, Mrs. Sawyer. Men move between operations, share information." He took a step closer, his considerable height allowing him to look down at her in what was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Truth is, we've got experience with exactly the kind of deposit you're sitting on. Might be, we could offer valuable assistance in exchange for a fair arrangement." Eleanor held her ground, adjusting her spectacles in a gesture calculated to reinforce her image as a genteel widow, while giving her a moment to observe the positions of her workers around the camp. Rodrigo had positioned himself near the assay office with Jackson and Williams nearby, all three clearly watching the interaction while pretending to focus on their tasks. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Kent, but Whispering Creek's current staff includes highly experienced miners." She gestured toward the dining hall. "Our cook, Mrs. Wilson, can provide you and your men with a meal before you continue your journey if you wish." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Kent's expression tightened momentarily before he forced another smile. "Most hospitable of you, Mrs. Sawyer. Perhaps we'll take you up on that offer." His eyes swept over the mining operation, once more calculating. "But I wonder if I might trouble you for a brief tour first, always instructive to see how different mines are managed." The request was a transparent attempt to assess the mine's defenses and value more thoroughly. Eleanor weighed her options, recognizing that an outright refusal might accelerate whatever timeline Kent had planned. Better to control his access, learn what she could of his intentions, and prepare accordingly. A brief tour would be no trouble at all. She agreed with a smile that mirrored his in its lack of sincerity. "Though I'm afraid the lower shaft remains closed pending safety inspections. I wouldn't want visitors to be at risk." As Eleanor led Kent toward the main tunnel, outwardly every inch, the accommodating business owner, her mind was already racing several steps ahead. These men were not what they claimed, and their interest in Whispering Creek had nothing to do with employment. Whether cattle rustlers expanding their territory or something more specific, they represented a threat she would need to address. The main tunnel of Whispering Creek mine swallowed sound in its cool darkness, the temperature dropping noticeably as Eleanor led Kent deeper into the mountain. Oil lamps hung at regular intervals along rough-hewn walls, casting elongated shadows that danced with their movement. The rhythmic striking of picks against stone echoed from side passages where miners worked narrow seams of ore. "Not what I expected." Kent commented, his voice bouncing off the stone walls as his eyes assessed support beams and surveyed equipment with the practiced gaze of someone who understood mining operations. Sawyer ran a tight operation. My husband believed in doing things properly. Eleanor replied, noting how Kent studied every detail, counting miners, evaluating escape routes, measuring the mine's defenses with calculating precision. Safety was his primary concern. Ironic considering how he died. The comment was deliberately provocative, testing her reaction. Eleanor's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Samuel's death was investigated thoroughly by the territorial inspector. A support beam failed in the lower shaft, a beam that had been recently replaced and should have held. Kent's eyebrows rose with apparent interest. Suggesting what exactly? Nothing was ever proven. Eleanor kept her tone neutral despite the painful memories his question evoked. They continued in silence until reaching a heavy wooden barrier, blocking a side tunnel that angled downward into darkness. Faded lettering across the planks warned danger. Closed by order of management. The lower shaft, I presume? Kent asked, reaching out to touch the weathered wood. Eleanor positioned herself between Kent and the barrier. As I mentioned earlier, it's closed pending safety evaluations. The structural integrity was compromised during the accident. Kent's eyes narrowed slightly. Curious timing that you're suddenly interested in reopening it after 2 years. Almost as if someone told you what might be waiting down there. The accusation hung in the air between them, confirming Eleanor's suspicion that these men had inside information. She adjusted her spectacles, using the gesture to scan the tunnel behind them, where Turner had followed at a distance, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. Mining is as much intuition as science, Mr. Kent. My husband left detailed journals of his work. I've simply been reviewing them more thoroughly in recent months. Before Kent could respond, the distinctive sound of a minecart's wheels on tracks approached from behind. A young miner pushed the half-filled cart toward them, slowing, as he noticed the visitors blocking the narrow passage. Pardon, Mrs. Sawyer, he called, his voice carrying the lilt of an Irish accent. Need to get this ore to the sorting shed. Of course, Danny, Eleanor replied, using the interruption to create distance between herself and Kent as they pressed against the tunnel wall to allow the cart to pass. Kent watched the young miner with unusual intensity. New hire. Danny joined us 3 months ago, hard worker. Eleanor noted Kent's interest with concern. Shall we continue toward the main shaft? The engineering is quite impressive. Samuel designed the bracing system himself. As they resumed walking, Eleanor's mind categorized potential threats and advantages throughout the mine. The tunnels offered confined spaces where her smaller frame and intimate knowledge of the layout would give her an edge if confrontation became necessary. The miners themselves were skilled with tools that could serve as weapons, though few carried firearms underground, due to the danger of accidental discharge in the confined space. Most importantly, she knew what Kent did not: the location of a secondary exit Samuel had created as an emergency escape route after a cave-in had temporarily trapped miners 3 years earlier. The narrow passage emerged nearly a quarter mile from the main entrance, hidden among rocks that made it all but invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Their tour concluded at the main shaft, where an elaborate system of pulleys and cables controlled the lift that transported men and materials between levels. Kent studied the mechanism with undisguised appreciation. Your husband was no ordinary mining engineer, he observed, watching as the platform descended with 2 miners aboard. This is custom work. Samuel believed innovation was essential in mining, Eleanor replied, genuine pride momentarily replacing her wariness. He designed several improvements that have since been adopted by larger operations. Kent turned to face her fully, his earlier pretense of friendly interest fading into something more direct. Mrs. Sawyer, let's speak plainly. Your mine is struggling. That's common knowledge in these parts. The accessible ore is depleting, your workforce has dwindled, and you lack the capital to expand operations effectively. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Yet you seem remarkably interested in acquiring it. I represent interests that can inject the necessary resources to make Whispering Creek profitable again. Kent continued, abandoning his prospector pretense. $20,000, a generous offer for a failing operation. Enough for you to return east and live comfortably. The sum was substantial, more than fair for the mine's apparent value based on current production, but it confirmed what Eleanor already suspected. Kent knew exactly what lay in the lower shaft, and it was worth considerably more than his offer. Whispering Creek is not for sale, Mr. Kent, she replied with quiet firmness. It was my husband's life's work, and I intend to honor his legacy by continuing it. Saharmini. Frustration flickered across Kent's features before he mastered it. Sentimentality is an expensive luxury, Mrs. Sawyer. Your husband is dead, and this mine is slowly following him to the grave. $20,000 is more than fair. This discussion is concluded. Eleanor stated, her gentle demeanor hardening. Rodrigo will show you and your men to the dining hall if you're still interested in that meal. Otherwise, I wish you safe travels. Kent studied her face for a long moment, searching for weaknesses and finding fewer than he had expected. We'll be staying in the area for a few days. He finally said, his tone carrying an unmistakable warning. Perhaps you'll reconsider once you've had time to reflect on your situation. Saratiin. The dining hall at Whispering Creek was a simple wooden structure that served as communal space for the dozen men who still worked the mine. Inside, Kent and his companions sat at a corner table, speaking in low tones while occasionally glancing toward the door. She knows something, Kent muttered, tearing a piece of bread with unnecessary force. The widow isn't as naive as we were led to believe. Turner shrugged his pock-marked face, impassive. Doesn't matter what she knows. We've got the numbers and the guns. Question is timing tonight or wait another day. Charlie, the youngest of the three, looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Maybe we should try offering more. She seemed real attached to the place because of her husband. Kent fixed the young man with a cold stare. 30 men have joined the Black Wolves over the years, Charlie. Know how many are still riding with us? 8? No, He jabbed a finger toward the table's surface for emphasis. Because I don't tolerate softness. That woman is sitting on a gold deposit worth hundreds of thousands, and she doesn't even know it. We're taking it tonight, and she'll be lucky if all she loses is the mine. Their conversation halted as the dining hall door opened, admitting a burly miner whose massive frame seemed at odds with his gentle movements. The man nodded respectfully to Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman who managed the kitchen, before noticing the three strangers in the corner. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he made no comment as he collected a cup of coffee. Garrett, Mrs. Wilson called to him, is Rodrigo still wanting that repair to the sorting shed roof before the next shipment? Yes, ma'am, the large man replied, his deep voice surprisingly soft. Planning to see to it this afternoon, weather permitting. Kent watched the exchange with interest, cataloging another name and face for later reference. Once Garrett had departed with his coffee, Kent leaned closer to his companions. We move at midnight, he whispered. Charlie, ride back to Owen and tell him to bring the others. We'll need all hands for this. As Charlie rose to leave, Kent caught his arm in a grip that would leave bruises. And Charlie, no more talk about offering the widow more money. When we're done, she'll be grateful just to walk away with her life. In the privacy of her cabin, Eleanor meticulously cleaned the matched Colt revolvers she had retrieved from their hiding place. Each movement was practiced and efficient muscle memory from years when maintaining her weapons had been as routine as breathing. The pearl grips gleamed in the afternoon light filtering through the window, the only ornamentation on otherwise utilitarian tools. Rodrigo sat opposite her at the small table, his weathered face grave as he watched her preparations. The foreman was the only person at Whispering Creek who knew anything of Eleanor's past, though even he didn't know the full extent of her former identity. They will come tonight, he stated with certainty. I saw them watching the guard rotations, counting our men. Eleanor nodded, checking the cylinder of the second revolver before returning it to its holster. Kent doesn't strike me as a man who tolerates delays once he's decided on a course of action. Kent, Rodrigo repeated thoughtfully. Not his real name, I think. No. Eleanor agreed, beginning to sort ammunition, selecting only the cartridges she knew to be most reliable. I believe his name is Victor Blackwood. Rodrigo's eyes widened with recognition. The rustler leader of the Black Wolves gang. The same. Eleanor's expression remained composed as she continued her work. They believe there's a rich gold deposit in the lower shaft, one valuable enough to justify killing for. Is there, Rodrigo asked his direct question, reflecting years of mutual respect. Eleanor's hands paused in their work. Samuel thought so. The night before the accident, he told me he'd found something significant, a new vein that angled away from where they'd been digging. Her voice remained steady despite the painful memory. He was excited, planned to explore it the next day. He never got the chance. And you believe his death wasn't an accident. The support beam that failed had been replaced just days earlier. Samuel supervised the work himself. Eleanor resumed loading cartridges into a belt designed to fit beneath her clothing. Someone wanted that vein to remain undiscovered. Rodrigo processed this information in silence before asking, "What do you need from me?" "Get as many men out of camp as possible without raising suspicion," Eleanor instructed. "Send teams to the North Ridge for prospecting. Tell them I've authorized extra pay for the night shift. The fewer people here, when Blackwood makes his move, the better." "Garrett will stay," Rodrigo stated rather than asked, "and Jackson. They were both Army men before turning to mining. They can handle themselves." Eleanor nodded in agreement. 3 miners with combat experience plus the 2 of us against however many men Blackwood brings. Not favorable odds, but I've faced worse. Rodrigo studied her with newfound curiosity. "You have lived an interesting life, Senor Sawyer." A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "More interesting than anyone in these parts would believe Rodrigo, and considerably more violent." As Rodrigo departed to begin evacuating selected miners, Eleanor returned the weapons to their hiding place. Tonight she would become someone she had hoped never to be again, a dealer in death, rather than a respectable widow. The transformation brought neither joy nor sorrow, only a grim acceptance that some parts of ourselves can never truly be abandoned. Turfhorn. Sheriff Daniel Holden's monthly visits to the outlying properties in his jurisdiction were more courtesy than necessity. At 58, with a slight limp from an old bullet wound and thinning gray hair beneath his wide-brimmed hat, he cut a less imposing figure than he once had. Still, his reputation for fairness and unwavering courage ensured respect throughout the county. His arrival at Whispering Creek that afternoon coincided with unusual activity teams of miners, departing with equipment loaded on mules heading toward the northern ridges despite the late hour. The sheriff reined his horse to a stop near the assay office where Eleanor stood reviewing documents with Rodrigo. "Afternoon, Mrs. Sawyer," he called, dismounting with a slight grimace as his bad leg took his weight. "Looks like you've got men heading out rather than coming in. Kid Foirin found a new prospect." Eleanor greeted him with the warm smile she reserved for the few people in her new life she genuinely trusted. Sheriff Holden had been Samuel's friend before becoming hers, and his monthly visits were typically social occasions as much as official business. "Following a hunch, Sheriff," she replied, accepting his offered handshake. "Samuel always believed the North Ridge held promise. Seemed time to investigate properly." Holden's eyes still sharp despite his advancing years. Noted details others might miss: the tension in Eleanor's posture, the unusual number of men remaining in camp, who carried sidearms, the watchful positioning of Garrett near the main entrance to the mine. "Must be quite a hunch to justify overtime for so many men," he observed casually, though his gaze had turned searching. Rodrigo excused himself to oversee the departing teams, leaving Eleanor alone with the lawman. She considered her options carefully before speaking. "Walk with me, Daniel," she suggested, using his given name, as she did only in private. "There are matters I'd value your perspective on." They strolled toward the edge of camp, where pines offered shade from the afternoon sun, stopping at a point that offered a view of both the approach road and the mining operation. For several moments they stood in companionable silence before Eleanor spoke. "We had visitors this morning. 3 men claiming to be prospectors looking for work." Holden's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Unusual timing, given your current staffing challenges." "They called themselves Kent Turner and Charlie. Their actual identities are Victor Blackwood Wade Turner and a younger man I don't recognize." "The Black Wolves." Holden murmured, his hand moving unconsciously toward his holstered Colt. "Blackwood's bunch has never hit mining operations before. They believe there's a particularly rich vein in the lower shaft, one valuable enough to change their usual patterns." Eleanor turned to face him directly. "I'm sending as many innocent people away as I can manage without alerting them, but I expect trouble tonight." Holden studied her with new intensity. "I should ride for deputies. With enough men from Copper Springs, they'll move before you could possibly return." Eleanor interrupted gently. "Besides, your presence here might accelerate their timeline. You're suggesting I leave you to face the black wolves alone? Disbelief colored the sheriff's voice. Eleanor, I can't do that. Samuel would. Samuel knew more about me than most, she interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily, including certain skills from my life before Colorado. Understanding dawned slowly in the sheriff's eyes. You were something more than a schoolteacher back east. He said the statement, not quite a question. Something considerably more, Eleanor confirmed with a slight nod. I can handle Victor Blackwood and his men, Daniel, but I need you to ensure the law recognizes my actions as justified when this is over. The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair as he processed her words. You're asking me to ride away knowing there's going to be bloodshed, possibly multiple deaths. I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing, Eleanor clarified, and to understand that some confrontations are inevitable, regardless of how much we might wish to avoid them. Holden replaced his hat, his expression troubled but resolute. I'll ride as far as Copper Springs. He decided, naming a small settlement approximately an hour away. I'll wait there until morning. If I haven't heard from you by dawn, I'll return with whatever men I can gather. Relief softened Eleanor's features momentarily. Thank you, Daniel. That's more than fair. As the sheriff prepared to depart, he paused beside his horse, fixing Eleanor with a penetrating look. Samuel once told me there was more to you than met the eye. Said you carried shadows that had nothing to do with being a miner's wife. He tightened the cinch on his saddle with practiced movements. Always wondered what he meant by that. Perhaps after tonight I'll tell you the full story, Eleanor offered, though uncertainty tinged her voice. Assuming there's still a place for me here when it's over. Holden mounted his horse with a grunt of effort. Whatever happens, whatever you've been, this is your home now. Remember that. With a final nod, he turned his mount toward the road leading away from Whispering Creek dust, rising in small clouds beneath his horse's hooves. Eleanor watched him go, wondering if his assessment would hold true once the truth was known. The peaceful life she had built with Samuel and fought to maintain after his death hung by an increasingly frayed thread. By morning, the facade of the genteel widow would likely be shattered beyond repair, revealing the deadly hunter beneath. As shadows lengthened across the mining camp, Eleanor returned to her cabin to make final preparations. The black wolves were coming, bringing with them violence that would force her to become once more the woman she had tried so hard to leave behind. The ghost, whose twin colts had claimed 23 lives in the name of justice. By dawn, that number would almost certainly increase. Twilight painted the western sky in bands of crimson and gold as Eleanor stood before the small mirror in her cabin, regarding her reflection with detached curiosity. The transformation was both subtle and profound. Gone were the spectacles that had softened her appearance for years. Her chestnut hair, freed from its restrictive bun, hung in a practical braid down her back. The high-collared blouse and proper skirt had been replaced by dark trousers and a fitted jacket that allowed freedom of movement while concealing the twin colts holstered at her waist. The face that stared back at her seemed to belong to a stranger, or rather to someone she had once known intimately, but had deliberately forgotten. The gentle curves of the widow Sawyer had given way to the sharp angles of a hunter's vigilance. Even her eyes appeared different, the warm hazel hardening to the color of sun-baked earth. There you are, she whispered to her reflection. I wondered if you still existed. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Senora, Rodrigo called through the door. They're coming, dust on the eastern approach. Eleanor opened the door to find her foreman similarly transformed. Gone was the deferential employee. In his place stood a man whose steady gaze and balanced stance spoke of experience with violence. A Winchester rifle rested comfortably in his hands, and a worn cartridge belt circled his waist. How many, she asked, collecting a black hat from a peg beside the door, the final piece of her transformation. At least 8 riders, Rodrigo reported, moving slowly still about 20 minutes out. Garrett and Jackson are in position at the main shaft. Williams has taken up watch on the north ridge with a spyglass. Eleanor nodded her approval of these arrangements, and the remaining workers all gone except for Mrs. Wilson. The old woman refused to leave her kitchen, Rodrigo replied with a slight smile. Said no outlaws would prevent her from preparing tomorrow's bread. Mrs. Wilson is tougher than most men I've known, Eleanor observed with a faint smile. Keep her away from the fighting if possible, but I suspect she'll handle herself if necessary. Together they moved across the darkening camp toward the assay office, which offered both tactical advantages for defense and clear sight lines to the approach road. Eleanor's movements had changed, Rodrigo noted with fascination. The measured, deliberate steps of the mine owner had been replaced by a predatory grace, silent and efficient, wasting no energy as she glided through evening shadows, like a hunting cat. "You've done this before," Rodrigo observed quietly as they took up positions inside the office prepared for ambush. Eleanor checked the loads in her revolvers one final time before responding. "More times than I care to remember. This territory breeds a particular kind of violence, one that requires a particular kind of response." She moved to the window using the edge of the frame for concealment as she studied the eastern horizon. A faint cloud of dust marked the approach of Victor Blackwood's men, silhouetted against the deepening blue of the evening sky. "There was a massacre near Denver," Rodrigo said thoughtfully. 7 years ago, a family of settlers killed for their land. The territorial marshals couldn't find the culprits, but a bounty hunter tracked them for weeks, brought one man to justice, and sent 2 more to their graves." Eleanor remained focused on the horizon, neither confirming nor denying the implied connection. "Justice takes many forms in these territories. Sometimes the law needs assistance." The bounty hunter wore black. Rodrigo continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. "Appeared like a shadow at dawn or dusk. Some who saw this hunter said it was a ghost, an angel of death collecting the souls of the wicked." Now Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Superstitious nonsense. I was just a woman with a particular set of skills and a strong sense of right and wrong." The inadvertent admission hung between them for a moment, before Rodrigo nodded slowly. "As you are tonight, Senora, as you are tonight." Their conversation ended as the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Eleanor moved deeper into the shadowed interior of the office, positioning herself where she could observe without being seen. "Remember," she instructed quietly, "we defend, we don't pursue. If Blackwood's men scatter, let them go. I want him and his lieutenants, not every misguided fool who rides with him." Rodrigo took up his position on the opposite side of the office, rifle ready. "And if Blackwood escapes?" Eleanor's expression hardened in the darkness. "He won't." Victor Blackwood led his expanded force into Whispering Creek's central yard with the confidence of a man who expected little resistance. The 8 riders moved in practiced formation, spreading out to cover the main buildings, while maintaining clear lines of fire between them. Victor himself, flanked by Wade Turner and the recently returned Charlie, approached the darkened cabin that served as Eleanor's residence and office. "Mighty quiet," Wade observed suspiciously, his scarred face tightening as he scanned the surrounding structures. "Where are all the miners?" "Night shifts probably in the tunnels," Victor replied, though his expression revealed similar concern at the camp's stillness. "Widow's likely in her cabin." Owen Jenkins, the former miner, whose information had brought them to Whispering Creek, sidled his horse closer. "Something's wrong, Victor. There should be men moving between shifts lights in the cookhouse." Victor silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Spread out," he ordered the others. "Check the bunkhouse assay office and main shaft. Charlie, you're with me." As the riders dispersed to follow his commands, Victor dismounted before Eleanor's cabin, drawing his revolver with practiced ease. "Mrs. Sawyer," he called loud enough to be heard within, but not to carry across the entire camp. "I'd like to continue our business discussion." Silence answered him. Victor exchanged glances with Charlie, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Kick it in," Victor ordered, gesturing toward the door. Charlie hesitated. "Maybe she's not here. Could be with the miners or—" "I said kick it in, boy." Victor's tone left no room for debate. The younger man reluctantly dismounted and approached the cabin door. His boot connected solidly with the wood near the latch, splintering as it swung inward. The door swung open to reveal darkness, the cabin's interior illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through windows. Victor pushed past Charlie, striking a match to light the oil lamp on the small desk. The warm glow revealed an empty cabin. The bed neatly made a half-finished cup of tea on the table, suggesting the occupant had departed in the midst of her evening routine. She knew we were coming, Victor snarled, extinguishing the match with a sharp motion of his wrist. Someone warned her. Outside, a sudden shout from the direction of the main shaft shattered the night's quiet. A single gunshot followed then another. Victor rushed to the doorway in time to see one of his men thrown backward from the entrance to the mine, his body crumpling in a lifeless heap on the ground. "It's a trap," Wade called from where he'd taken cover behind a water trough. "They're waiting for us." Victor cursed viciously, scanning the darkened camp for signs of movement. The strategic disadvantage of their position became suddenly painfully clear. They were exposed in the central yard while defenders could fire from the concealment of doorways and windows. Another shot rang out from the direction of the assay office, striking a rider who had ventured too close. The man clutched his shoulder with a cry of pain, wheeling his horse in a frantic circle before gaining control. "Get to cover," Victor ordered Charlie, pushing the younger man toward the relative safety of the cabin's interior. He raised his voice to address the scattered members of his gang. "Find the widow. She's the key to this place." From her vantage point in the assay office, Eleanor watched the confusion spreading among Blackwood's men with grim satisfaction. The initial volley had caught them unprepared, shattering their expectations of an easy conquest. Now they scrambled for cover, their formation broken coordination, lost in the chaos of unexpected resistance. Rodrigo fired again, his shot striking a water barrel near one of the outlaws, sending the man diving for better protection. "They do not fight well when surprised," he observed dryly. "Few do," Eleanor replied, her attention focused on the cabin where Victor Blackwood had retreated with the younger gang member. She noted the positions of the remaining riders, 3 seeking shelter near the cookhouse, 2 returning fire from behind mining equipment, and 1 wounded man struggling to control his panicked horse. Wade Turner had established a defensive position behind the water trough, while Owen Jenkins, whom she recognized from his time working the mine, was frantically trying to rally the others from behind a stack of lumber. "Focus on the ones by the cookhouse," Eleanor instructed Rodrigo. "Keep them pinned down. I'm going to circle behind and approach the cabin from the rear." Rodrigo nodded, already adjusting his aim. "Be careful, Senora. Blackwood strikes me as a man who grows more dangerous when cornered." Eleanor slipped out the back door of the assay office, keeping to the shadows, as she moved swiftly along the perimeter of the camp. The sporadic exchange of gunfire continued, providing cover for her approach as she circled toward her cabin. Years of tracking criminals across difficult terrain had taught her how to move undetected, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid creating sound. Reaching the back of her cabin, she paused to listen. Voices filtered through the thin walls, Victor Blackwood issuing harsh instructions, the younger man responding with audible reluctance. Through a small window, she could make out their shadows moving inside the lamp-lit interior. "Don't care how many men they have," Victor was saying, his tone vicious with frustration. "We find the widow, we control the mine. Everything else is just obstacles." She could be anywhere," the younger voice protested. "Could have ridden for the law for all we know." "No," Victor countered with certainty. "A woman like that doesn't abandon what's hers." The insight surprised Eleanor. Victor Blackwood had perceived something fundamental about her character despite their brief interaction. Perhaps he was more dangerous than she had initially assessed. She moved silently to the rear door, testing the handle with exquisite caution. It turned without sound. She had oiled the hinges just hours earlier in preparation for exactly this moment. Drawing one of her revolvers, Eleanor eased the door open, just enough to slip inside, finding herself in the small kitchen area, separated from the main room by a partial wall. "We need to pull back," Charlie was insisting, panic edging into his voice. "Regroup with the others. Figure out what we're up against." "Coward," Victor spat. "I knew you didn't have the stomach for real work. This mine is worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary." "No mine is worth dying for," Eleanor stated calmly, stepping around the dividing wall with her Colt leveled at Victor's chest. Both men froze at her sudden appearance, their expressions displaying radically different reactions. Charlie's face registered shock tinged with relief, as if her presence offered an escape from the escalating situation. Victor's features shifted from surprise to calculation in an instant, his eyes narrowing as he took in her transformed appearance. "Well now," he drawled, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Mrs. Sawyer, you're full of surprises. Or should I call you something else?" My name doesn't matter. Eleanor replied, her aim unwavering. What matters is that you miscalculated badly, Mr. Blackwood. Whispering Creek Mine isn't defenseless, and I'm not the helpless widow you assumed I was. Victor's expression darkened at her use of his real name. So you knew all along. Impressive. But it doesn't change the outcome. I have 8 men out there. You can't possibly have more than 3 or 4 defenders. Quality over quantity. Eleanor countered, her voice taking on the harder edge of her former persona. Your men are already falling. Surrender now and you might leave this camp alive. A dangerous smile spread across Victor's face. I don't surrender, ma'am. Never have, never will. His gaze shifted fractionally over her shoulder. Especially when I hold the high cards. Eleanor sensed movement behind her a split second before Wade Turner's voice cut through the tension. Drop the gun, lady, or I ventilate that pretty head of yours. She didn't need to turn to know Wade had entered through the front door while she focused on Victor. The cold pressure of a gun barrel against the back of her neck confirmed her tactical error. She had underestimated the coordination between the gang members. Slowly now, Wade instructed, as Victor's smile widened in triumph. Place it on the floor and kick it over here. Eleanor assessed her options in the fleeting moment before she would need to comply. The second Colt remained holstered at her left hip, concealed by her jacket, but drawing it would be suicide with Wade's gun pressed against her skull. Victor stood too far away for a sudden lunge, and the young Charlie seemed paralyzed by the rapidly escalating situation. She lowered her revolver, gradually kneeling to place it on the wooden floorboards. As she straightened, preparing to kick it toward Victor, a tremendous crash shattered the window. Behind Wade, followed instantly by the deafening report of a shotgun blast. Wade screamed, stumbling forward as buckshot tore through his right shoulder and arm. His gun clattered to the floor as he collapsed to his knees. Eleanor reacted with the lightning reflexes that had once made her legend, diving sideways while drawing her second Colt in a fluid motion. Victor's hand flew to his holster, but Eleanor's aim proved faster. Her first shot caught him high in the chest, staggering him backward. Her second struck his right arm, causing his half-drawn revolver to fall from suddenly nerveless fingers. Nobody threatens my people in my kitchen. Mrs. Wilson's indignant voice carried through the shattered window where the elderly cook stood with her smoking shotgun still braced against her shoulder. Especially not some mangy coyotes who interrupt my bread making. Victor Blackwood sagged against the wall, blood spreading across his shirt in an expanding crimson stain. His eyes, wide with shock, fixed on Eleanor with dawning recognition. I know you, he gasped, each word clearly painful. The Black Duster, twin Colts. You're the one they called the Ghost. Charlie stood frozen, hands raised in surrender, as Wade moaned on the floor, clutching his shredded shoulder. Outside, the gunfire had diminished to occasional scattered shots, suggesting the battle was reaching its conclusion. Eleanor approached Victor slowly, her revolver trained on his chest. You should have done your research more thoroughly, Mr. Blackwood. You might have chosen a different target. Odadun. Blood bubbled at the corner of Victor's mouth as he laughed, a wet, choking sound. Liam always said the bounty hunter who took him in had the coldest eyes he'd ever seen. He coughed crimson, spattering his chin. Never mentioned it was a woman. Understanding flooded Eleanor's expression. Liam Blackwood. I brought him in for the Wallace family murders near Denver. My brother, Victor confirmed, his voice weakening, swore I'd find who sent him to the gallows. Never thought. Hamidiyamur. He slid further down the wall, leaving a smear of blood against the wood. Eleanor holstered her weapon and knelt beside him, recognizing that Victor Blackwood no longer posed a threat. Your brother murdered an entire family, including a young daughter, for their land. He admitted it before they hanged him. He was still my brother, Victor whispered, his eyes growing unfocused as blood loss took its toll. Only family I had left. In that moment, Eleanor saw beyond the hardened outlaw to the wounded core, beneath a man whose twisted sense of loyalty had led him down a path of destruction and ultimately to his death on the floor of her cabin. It was a story she had witnessed too many times during her years as a bounty hunter, how violence begat violence in an endless cycle of retribution and loss. I'm sorry for your pain, she said quietly, meaning it despite everything. But not for bringing your brother to justice. He made his choices, as did you. Victor's gaze fixed on something distant beyond the cabin walls. Funny, he murmured, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Always thought I'd die under open sky, not trapped in some mine widow's cabin. His chest rose and fell once more, a rattling breath escaping his lips, and then he was still. Eleanor reached forward and gently closed his staring eyes, a final gesture of respect for an adversary who, however misguided, had fought for what he believed in. Then she rose and turned her attention to the wounded Wade Turner and the still surrendering Charlie. "Your leader is dead," she stated flatly. "The wisest course now would be to tell your remaining men to drop their weapons." Charlie nodded frantically. "I'll do it. Just don't shoot me, ma'am. Please. I'm not in the business of killing surrendering men," Eleanor assured him, reclaiming her first revolver from the floor. "But make no mistake, if your men continue fighting, they'll die as surely as Victor Blackwood." Rodrigo appeared in the doorway, his rifle held ready, but pointed downward. "The others are retreating, Senora. 2 more dead, 1 badly wounded. The rest are scattering toward the eastern hills. Help this young man convince the stragglers to surrender," Eleanor instructed, gesturing toward Charlie. "And send Jackson to retrieve the doctor from Copper Springs. Sheriff Holden should be there as well." As Rodrigo led Charlie outside, Eleanor turned to where Mrs. Wilson had appeared at the broken window, shotgun still clutched in her gnarled hands. The elderly cook surveyed the scene with remarkable composure for someone who had just entered a gunfight. "Thank you for your timely intervention," Eleanor said with genuine gratitude. "Your aim was impeccable." Mrs. Wilson sniffed dismissively. "Been handling a shotgun since before you were born, Mrs. Sawyer, or whatever your name actually is." Despite her brisk tone, there was no condemnation in her weathered face, only the practical acceptance of someone who had survived long enough on the frontier to understand that people often carried secrets and hidden strengths. "Eleanor is my real name," she replied with a faint smile. "The rest is complicated." "Most worthwhile things are," the cook observed sagely. "Now I've got dough rising that won't wait for outlaws or revelations. When you're done with all this unpleasantness, there'll be fresh bread." As Mrs. Wilson retreated toward her kitchen, Eleanor stood in the bullet-scarred remains of her cabin, surrounded by the aftermath of violence she had hoped never to witness again. Victor Blackwood lay dead at her feet, the culmination of a vendetta that had begun years ago with his brother's crimes and her own pursuit of justice. Outside, the night had grown still, except for the movements of the survivors securing the mining camp. The transformation was complete. Widow Sawyer had vanished like morning mist, revealing the ghost to a world she had hoped would never see that side of her again. By dawn, Sheriff Holden would arrive, and the full reckoning would begin, not just for the remaining members of the Black Wolves, but for Eleanor herself. Her carefully constructed life lay in ruins around her, much like the cabin that had been her sanctuary. Whatever came next would require building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed this night. First light crept across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in delicate washes of pink and gold that belied the night of violence. At Whispering Creek Mine, the acrid scent of gunpowder still hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the smoky aftermath of the conflict. Workers who had been sent away for safety were beginning to return their expressions, a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension as they surveyed the damage. 3 bodies lay covered with canvas tarps near the assay office: Victor Blackwood and 2 of his men who had fallen in the initial exchange of gunfire. The wounded had been moved to the cookhouse, where Mrs. Wilson alternated between administering to their injuries and muttering disapproval at the interruption to her normal routine. Wade Turner, his shoulder heavily bandaged, sat slumped against the wall, his once threatening presence diminished by pain and the knowledge that his gang had been shattered. In the yard between buildings, the young outlaw Charlie stood with his hands bound, watching as Rodrigo directed returning miners to secure the camp. The boy, for he seemed little more than that in the harsh morning light, had surrendered completely, offering information about the Black Wolves' operations with the desperate hope of leniency. Eleanor observed these activities from the porch of her damaged cabin, having changed from her night's attire into a simple blouse and skirt that represented a middle ground between her 2 identities. The twin Colts remained holstered at her waist, no longer concealed. There seemed little point in hiding what everyone now knew. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, not yet arranged in either the severe bun of the widow or the practical braid of the bounty hunter. Garrett, the burly miner who had proven himself during the night's defense, approached with a steaming cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this, ma'am," he offered, his deep voice respectful. "Been a long night." "Thank you, Garrett." Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully. "How are the men?" "Confused mostly," he replied with a shrug of massive shoulders. "Trying to reconcile the lady who's been signing their pay with the woman who killed 3 men last night." Eleanor finished for him, her tone matter of fact. "It's understandable. I've spent years keeping those worlds separate." Garrett nodded, seemingly untroubled by the revelation. "Army taught me to judge folks by what they do, not who they were before. You protected this mine, protected all of us. That counts for something." Before Eleanor could respond, a rider appeared on the approach road, dust rising behind the horse pushed to a canter. She recognized Sheriff Holden's distinctive silhouette, his badge catching the early morning light as he drew closer. "Sheriff's here," Garrett observed unnecessarily. "Want me to stay?" Eleanor shook her head. "I need to face this alone. Please check on the wounded, see if any need to be moved to town when the doctor arrives." As Garrett departed, Eleanor straightened her shoulders and moved to meet the approaching lawman. This moment had haunted her dreams for years, the inevitable collision of past and present, the judgment that would follow exposure of her carefully guarded secrets. Sheriff Holden reined his horse to a stop before her, his weathered face revealing a complex mixture of concern, relief, and uncertainty as he took in her appearance and the evidence of battle scattered across the mining camp. "You're alive," he stated, dismounting stiffly. "When I heard gunfire echoing through the canyon last night, I feared the worst." "The fighting ended quickly," Eleanor replied. "Victor Blackwood and 2 others are dead. 3 wounded, 1 captured. The rest fled eastward." Holden's gaze traveled to the holstered Colts at her waist, then back to her face. Something in his expression shifted, recognition dawning as he reassessed the woman he thought he had known. "I sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Denver," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Mentioned the Black Wolves gang was targeting Whispering Creek. Marshal Davis is riding out personally with several deputies." The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "Davis," she repeated softly. "Robert Davis. You know the marshal?" Holden asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "We worked together years ago." Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to touch the grip of one Colt, a gesture of familiarity rather than threat. "He's the one who offered me a permanent position with the territorial law before I retired." Understanding spread across the sheriff's features. "You're her," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "The ghost, the bounty hunter who tracked the Wallace family killers." Eleanor neither confirmed nor denied it, but her silence was answer enough. The name hung between them, a legend she had never sought, a persona she had tried to abandon. "Samuel knew," Holden stated rather than asked. "That's why he said what he did about you carrying shadows. Samuel knew everything." Eleanor acknowledged a softness entering her voice at the mention of her late husband. "He was the first person who saw me, truly saw me as more than what I'd been. He offered a different path when I thought there was only one road left to travel." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair as he struggled to reconcile the refined widow he had known with the deadly efficient bounty hunter of frontier legend. "I need to hear it from you, Eleanor," he finally said. "What happened here last night?" Eleanor gestured toward the mine entrance. "Walk with me, Daniel. It's a long story, and parts of it go deeper than you might expect." The lower shaft of Whispering Creek Mine remained cool, even as the morning sun heated the world above. Eleanor led Sheriff Holden through the tunnel network that had been her husband's life's work oil lamp, in hand casting golden light against the rock walls. Rodrigo and Garrett accompanied them, carrying additional lamps and tools. "Victor Blackwood didn't target this mine by chance," Eleanor explained as they descended the reinforced passage that had been closed since Samuel's death. "He had inside information about what lies below, information that I believe cost my husband his life." "You're suggesting Samuel was murdered?" Holden's expression sharpened with professional interest. "The territorial inspector ruled it an accident." "The inspector saw what he was meant to see, a support beam that failed," Eleanor replied, her tone hardening. "What he didn't know was that Samuel had replaced that beam himself just days earlier. It was sabotaged." They reached the end of the main tunnel where heavy timbers blocked an opening, angled sharply downward. Rodrigo and Garrett set to work removing the barrier, while Eleanor continued her explanation. The night before he died, Samuel was excited, more animated than I'd seen him in months. He'd been following a narrow seam of gold that suddenly vanished. Most would have abandoned the effort, but Samuel had a theory about how veins sometimes shift direction due to ancient geological events. And he found something Holden guessed watching as the barrier came away to reveal the passage beyond. He found enough to make him believe this mine held far more value than anyone suspected, but he never got to confirm it. The next day, the supposedly new support beam failed catastrophically while he was working alone in this section. Rodrigo stepped forward, his expression grave. Owen Jenkins was one of the last men to see Don Samuel alive. He helped install the support beams in this section. The name connected instantly for Holden. Jenkins was with Blackwood last night, he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. You think he sabotaged the beam, then waited 2 years before returning with the Black Wolves to claim what he believed was here. 2 years of cattle rustling and stagecoach robberies. Eleanor confirmed, building enough capital to finance a mining operation once they took control. They needed funds for equipment, workers, engineers. Stealing Whispering Creek was just the first step in their plan. The barrier removed, they entered the lower shaft carefully. The tunnel showed signs of the fatal collapse, repaired walls, new support beams, evidence of the tragedy that had occurred. But it was what lay beyond the repaired section that held their attention. Samuel's final journal entry mentioned an unusual rock formation. Eleanor said, raising her lamp toward the tunnel wall, where a distinct band of darker stone cut across the lighter surrounding rock. He called it the path to the mother lode. This geological feature is what he was following when he died. Garrett stepped forward, running calloused fingers along the stone with the reverence of a man who had spent his life extracting treasure from the earth. I've seen this before in the Nevada mines. It's a fault line where mineral-rich solutions were forced upward through cracks in the bedrock. Follow this. He moved deeper into the tunnel, his lamp illuminating the continuation of the dark band as it angled sharply downward. The others followed until they reached a small chamber that Samuel had begun to excavate before his death. Here, Garrett directed his light toward the chamber's far wall, where a glittering vein of ore 3 inches wide ran vertically through the rock. Mother of God! Rodrigo breathed, crossing himself instinctively. Even to untrained eyes, the richness of the deposit was obvious. Threads of pure gold wove through the surrounding rock in intricate patterns, catching the lamplight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. High-grade gold, Garrett confirmed, his voice hushed with respect. Possibly the richest vein I've seen in 20 years of mining. Worth a fortune, maybe several fortunes. Sheriff Holden let out a low whistle. No wonder Blackwood was willing to kill for it. This could make a man wealthy beyond dreams. It's what got Samuel killed, Eleanor said quietly, touching the gleaming vein with gentle fingers. He found exactly what he'd been searching for, and someone made sure he never lived to claim it. The group fell silent, absorbing the magnitude of both the discovery and the tragedy that had accompanied it. The gold vein represented not just material wealth, but the vindication of Samuel Sawyer's vision and the motive for his murder. What will you do with it? Holden finally asked, turning to Eleanor. She met his gaze steadily. Exactly what Samuel would have wanted. Mine it responsibly. Ensure the men who work this claim are treated fairly and compensated well. Use the profits to build something that will outlast all of us. As they made their way back to the surface, Eleanor felt a sense of closure beginning to form around the wound that had remained open since Samuel's death. The truth of what he had discovered and why he had died provided answers to questions that had haunted her for 2 years. But other questions remained, particularly about her own future, now that her past had been exposed to the light of day. Something caught Eleanor's eye as they passed a small alcove, a wooden box wedged behind a support beam partially concealed by stones. It hadn't been there during their descent, and the fresh tool marks in the adjacent wall suggested it had been deliberately hidden. Wait, she said, stopping the grouping. She knelt and carefully extracted the box, recognizing it instantly as one of Samuel's. He had crafted several similar containers for ore samples, each bearing his distinctive woodworking style. Where did that come from? Holden asked, bending to examine it. I don't know, Eleanor replied, brushing dust from the lid. But it's Samuel's work. She opened it carefully, revealing a folded piece of paper and several small ore samples nestled in sawdust. The paper proved to be a detailed map of the lower shaft with annotations in Samuel's precise handwriting. But what caught her attention was a name scrawled in the margin: Owen Jenkins, Pioneer Gold Commander, $5,000. Pioneer Gold. Rodrigo read over her shoulder, his expression darkening. They've tried to buy Whispering Creek 3 times since Don Samuel died. Eleanor stared at the notation pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. Owen wasn't working with the Black Wolves from the beginning. He was working for Pioneer Gold. They wanted Samuel's discovery, and when he wouldn't sell, they arranged an accident. And you think Jenkins then joined Blackwood's gang? Holden questioned, following her reasoning. Or hired them, Eleanor suggested, examining the ore samples. These are deliberately selected to show the richness of the vein. Samuel was documenting the find and Owen's betrayal before he died. He must have hidden this knowing he was in danger. A cold certainty settled in Eleanor's stomach. If Owen was working for Pioneer, then Victor Blackwood's attack wasn't the end of this. It was just the beginning. As if in response to her words, a shout echoed down the tunnel from one of the miners stationed at the entrance. Riders approaching from the west, at least a dozen men. Holden's hand moved to his gun. More of Blackwood's gang. Eleanor shook her head, already moving toward the exit. No, Pioneer Gold is making their move. The morning sun cast harsh light across Whispering Creek as Eleanor emerged from the mine entrance, Sheriff Holden and the others close behind. On the western approach road, a column of riders advanced at a measured pace. 12 men on matching sorrel horses, led by a figure in an immaculate black suit that seemed deliberately out of place in the rugged terrain. Maxwell Hayes. Rodrigo identified the leader grimly. Regional Director for Pioneer Gold. Eleanor studied the approaching force with the calculating eye of a tactician. Unlike Blackwood's disorganized gang, these men moved with military precision. Most wore the distinctive canvas coats of company enforcers, men hired for their willingness to operate in the gray territory between corporate security and outright thuggery. They've been waiting, she realized aloud, watching to see if the Black Wolves succeeded, ready to step in regardless of the outcome. 12 against 6, Holden calculated, counting their able defenders. Not favorable odds. We've faced worse, Eleanor replied, her hand moving instinctively to the Colt at her hip. And we have something they don't know about yet. The gold vein. Proof of their conspiracy, she corrected, patting the wooden box now tucked securely inside her jacket. And the law on our side. Sheriff Holden straightened at this, his badge catching the sunlight as he moved to stand beside Eleanor. Rodrigo positioned himself on her other side, rifle held across his chest in a posture that managed to be both casual and threatening. Behind them, Garrett and the remaining miners formed a protective line armed with an assortment of weapons from shotguns to pickaxes. The riders halted at the edge of the mining camp, maintaining a deliberate distance close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid immediate conflict. Maxwell Hayes raised a gloved hand, bringing his entourage to a perfect stop. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the jingle of harness and the soft snort of horses, sensing the tension in the air. Quite the reception committee, Mrs. Sawyer. Hayes called, his voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education. One might think you weren't pleased to receive visitors. Pioneer Gold stopped being welcome visitors when they decided murder was an acceptable business strategy. Mr. Hayes, Eleanor replied, letting the accusation hang in the clear morning air. Hayes' eyebrows rose slightly at her directness, though his composed expression never faltered. I'm disappointed that our reputation has been so maligned. We've always maintained the highest professional standards in our dealings. Sheriff Holden stepped forward, his badge catching the sunlight. This property is currently under the protection of territorial law enforcement, Mr. Hayes. Any attempt to coerce or threaten Mrs. Sawyer or her operation will be met with the full force of that law. A flicker of annoyance crossed Hayes' aristocratic features before his composure reasserted itself. There seems to be a misunderstanding, Sheriff. Pioneer Gold is a legitimate business enterprise with interests throughout the territory. We've simply come to offer assistance after hearing of the unfortunate incident with Outlaws last night. Your concern is touching, Eleanor replied dryly, especially given its remarkable timing and the armed escort you deem necessary to express it. Hayes dismissed the observation with an elegant gesture. The territories remain dangerous as last night's events demonstrated. Prudent travelers employ protection. His gaze sharpened as he surveyed the mining camp, noting the evidence of the previous night's conflict: bullet holes in buildings, bloodstains not yet washed away, the tarp-covered forms still awaiting proper burial. Speaking of last night, I understand congratulations are in order. Not many mining operations could repel the notorious Black Wolves gang, particularly not operations run by widows. Sibitorno. The slight pause before the final word carried unmistakable condescension, but Eleanor detected something else beneath it, a recalculation, as if Hayes was reassessing what he thought he knew about her. Not many widows are former bounty hunters, Mr. Hayes. Holden interjected, his tone deliberately casual. Perhaps Pioneer wasn't aware of Mrs. Sawyer's particular skills when planning this visit. The revelation registered in Hayes's eyes, a calculation being revised, odds recalibrated. His gaze returned to Eleanor, with new assessment taking in the confident stance and the well-worn holsters that spoke of practical use rather than ornamental display. I see, he said finally. That does place matters in a different light. He paused, seemingly weighing options before continuing. Mrs. Sawyer, despite appearances, I am authorized to make a legitimate business proposal. Perhaps we could discuss it without this theatrical standoff. Eleanor considered the request, then nodded once. You may approach alone, Mr. Hayes. Your men remain where they are. After a moment's hesitation, Hayes dismounted and walked forward, the precision of his movements suggesting military training beneath the corporate exterior. He stopped several paces from Eleanor, close enough for private conversation, but maintaining a respectful distance. I'll be direct, he began, his voice lowered. Pioneer Gold knows what's in the lower shaft of Whispering Creek. The deposit is significant, perhaps the richest in the territory. Our offer is $80,000 for complete ownership of the mine. The sum was staggering, 4 times what Blackwood had offered, and far beyond what most believed the struggling mine to be worth, yet still less than the true value of what lay beneath. Not interested, Eleanor replied without hesitation. Hayes's facade of civility slipped momentarily. Be reasonable, Mrs. Sawyer. You lack the capital to exploit this deposit properly. Pioneer has the engineers, equipment, and distribution networks to maximize its potential. I have something more valuable than capital, Eleanor countered. Knowledge of what this mine truly means. It was my husband's dream, Mr. Hayes, his legacy, and I believe he was murdered to prevent him from realizing that dream. A tragic accident by all reports, Hayes replied smoothly, though something flickered behind his eyes. An accident arranged by someone who knew what Samuel had discovered. Eleanor stated, watching his reaction carefully. Someone who then waited patiently for the right moment to claim what wasn't theirs. Richard Claude hit the max length for a message and has paused its response. You can write continue to keep the chat going. End continue edit. Understanding dawned in Hayes's expression, followed quickly by calculation. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Sawyer. One that would be difficult to prove after so much time. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but territorial marshals are remarkably persistent when investigating murder, especially when the victim was respected and well-liked. She nodded toward Holden, who watched their exchange with the patient vigilance of a career lawman. And I have certain skills in uncovering hidden truths, as my former profession demonstrated. For the first time, genuine uncertainty showed in Hayes's demeanor. Whatever script he had prepared for this confrontation had not included facing a widow with the combined authority of frontier, justice, and personal vengeance at her disposal. Pioneer Gold had nothing to do with your husband's death, he stated firmly, though the protest came too quickly to be entirely convincing. I believe you. Eleanor surprised him by agreeing. Corporations don't kill people, Mr. Hayes. People kill people, often for corporations. She gestured toward the mine entrance, where miners continued working despite the tense standoff. Whispering Creek will remain independent. I'll develop this deposit my way, Samuel's way. The wealth will benefit the people who work this claim and the community that supports it. Very noble, Hayes replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but. And how long before larger interests simply overwhelm your independent operation? The mining industry is consolidating, Mrs. Sawyer. The future belongs to companies with the capital and political connections to dominate. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but not today and not this mine. Her hand rested casually near one pearl-handled Colt. Now I believe our business is concluded. Hayes studied her for a long moment, measuring resolve against practicality. Whatever calculation he made apparently convinced him that further pressure would be counterproductive. For now, he conceded with the careful dignity of a man unaccustomed to retreat. But Pioneer's offer remains open should you reconsider. I won't, Eleanor stated with quiet certainty. Without another word, Hayes turned and walked back to his waiting men. The company representatives departed as they had arrived in formation, maintaining the appearance of power and control even in withdrawal. As the dust settled behind the departing riders, Sheriff Holden moved to stand beside Eleanor. That won't be the end of it, he observed. Men like Hayes don't accept defeat easily. I'm counting on it, Eleanor replied, surprising him. Because when Pioneer tries again, and they will, they might lead us to whoever was ultimately responsible for Samuel's death. You're using yourself as bait, Holden realized, concern evident in his voice. I'm seeking justice, Eleanor corrected gently, and protecting what matters. Everything else is simply a means to those ends. The following days brought a transformation to Whispering Creek Mine. Work on the lower shaft proceeded with renewed purpose, the initial samples confirming what they had already seen. The gold vein was among the richest discoveries in Colorado's recent history. Word spread quickly, drawing former workers back and attracting new ones eager to be part of what promised to be a legendary strike. Eleanor found herself in an unexpected position. The revelation of her past as the ghost had not driven people away as she had feared. Instead, it seemed to have earned her a peculiar form of respect among the frontier community, a respect tinged with wariness, certainly, but respect nonetheless. People value strength out here, Sheriff Holden explained during one of his now frequent visits. They might fear it, but they value it, especially when it stands between them and those who would take what's theirs. Eleanor accepted this assessment with cautious optimism, though she remained vigilant. Pioneer Gold's retreat had been too easy, too calculated. Hayes would be planning his next move, gathering resources and information for a more decisive approach. The answer to her unspoken questions arrived on the 5th day after the confrontation, delivered not by corporate enforcers, but by the quiet clearing of a throat at her cabin door shortly after sunset. She looked up from Samuel's journals to find Owen Jenkins standing in the doorway, his hat clutched in nervous hands, his face gaunt with fear and something that might have been remorse. Behind him stood Rodrigo, rifle aimed steadily at the visitor's back. He came in alone, Senora. Rodrigo explained, his voice hard. Says he needs to speak with you. Personally. Eleanor studied the man who had once worked alongside her husband, the man she now believed responsible for Samuel's death. Owen's appearance had deteriorated dramatically since she'd last seen him during the Black Wolves' attack. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his eyes were sunken, and his hands trembled visibly as he twisted the brim of his hat. You have remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity, Mr. Jenkins, she observed coldly. Coming back to Whispering Creek after what you've done. Wasn't courage, Owen replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Wasn't stupidity neither. It was necessity. Eleanor gestured for Rodrigo to lower his weapon. Let him in, but stay close. As Owen stepped into the lamplight, the extent of his decline became even more apparent. Bruises marked one side of his face, and his breathing carried the rasp of damaged ribs. Pioneer's hospitality not to your liking? Eleanor asked, remaining seated behind her desk, the ledger closed beneath her folded hands. Owen's laugh was bitter and ended in a pained cough. They weren't too pleased about the failure at Whispering Creek. Hayes has a particular way of expressing disappointment. Why are you here, Owen? He met her gaze directly for the first time, something like desperation in his eyes. Because I'm a dead man either way, Mrs. Sawyer. Pioneer will kill me for failing them. The law will hang me for what I've done. Figure I might as well die with one less sin on my conscience. And what sin would that be? Letting Samuel's killer walk free while you blame me. The words fell into the quiet cabin like stones into still water ripples of implication spreading outward. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. Explain. Owen sank into the chair opposite her desk, his energy seemingly depleted by the admission. I helped set up Samuel's death, I admit that. Tampered with the support beam like they told me to. But I never meant for him to die. Was supposed to be a warning, scare him into selling after a close call. A warning that killed him. Eleanor's voice was flat. Yes, ma'am. Owen's shoulders slumped further. But I wasn't the one who changed the plan. I wasn't the one who made sure Samuel would be alone in that shaft when the beam gave way. That was someone else. Someone who knew his schedule, who knew exactly when he'd be inspecting the lower vein. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. Hayes says it was me. But it wasn't. It was someone closer to Samuel, someone he trusted completely. Owen leaned forward, lowering his voice as if fearing eavesdroppers. The day before it happened, I overheard them arguing in the assay office. Samuel was excited about the vein, talking about bringing in territorial inspectors to document the find officially. The other man told him to wait, said they needed to secure their claim first. Who was it, Owen? Eleanor demanded, her patience thinning. It was... The crack of a rifle shot shattered the night's quiet, and Owen Jenkins jerked backward, a look of surprise freezing on his face as crimson bloomed across his chest. He slumped forward onto Eleanor's desk, his life extinguished before he could complete his revelation. Eleanor reacted instantly, drawing her Colt while diving away from the desk. Rodrigo had already extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, illuminated only by slivers of moonlight through the windows. "Shooter on the ridge," Rodrigo whispered, peering cautiously around the doorframe. "High-powered rifle. Couldn't have been more than 3 people who knew Jenkins was here." Eleanor moved to the window, keeping to the shadows as she surveyed the darkened landscape. The mining camp had gone quiet, workers retreating to safety at the sound of gunfire. In the distance, she could see the small glow of a lantern moving rapidly away from the ridge, the shooter making his escape. "Whoever killed Owen knows we're getting close to the truth," she said quietly, "and they're desperate enough to risk a direct attack." Rodrigo nodded grimly. "What do we do now, Senora?" Eleanor turned to look at Owen's body, still slumped across her desk. The secrets he'd been about to reveal, silenced forever. "We spring the trap," she decided. "If the killer is watching this closely, we make them believe Owen told us everything before he died." "A dangerous game," Rodrigo observed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "But one I've played before. And this time the stakes are Samuel's justice." Word spread quickly throughout the region. Owen Jenkins had returned to Whispering Creek Mine to confess his role in Samuel Sawyer's death, naming his co-conspirators before being shot by an unknown assailant. The story, carefully crafted by Eleanor and shared by Sheriff Holden, contained just enough truth to be credible, while deliberately obscuring the fact that Owen had died before revealing the mastermind. Eleanor made a show of increasing security at the mine, posting armed guards and installing additional lamps to eliminate shadows where an intruder might hide. Privately, she set a different plan in motion, one that relied on the killer's increasing desperation. "You're creating a performance," Holden observed as they discussed the strategy and the relative safety of the mine's assay office. "Making the guilty party believe they've been exposed. Fear makes people careless," Eleanor replied, drawing on lessons learned during her years tracking fugitives. "Especially fear of imminent justice. They'll either run or try to eliminate the threat, which means coming after me directly." "And you're comfortable using yourself as bait?" the sheriff asked, concern evident in his weathered features. Eleanor's expression hardened. "For Samuel, yes." The trap was baited, the stage set. Now they needed only for the killer to make their move. 3 days passed with mounting tension. Eleanor deliberately maintained a predictable routine. Mornings in the office, afternoons, overseeing the lower shaft excavation, evenings in her cabin with the curtains drawn, but her silhouette clearly visible to anyone watching from outside. On the 4th evening, as darkness settled over Whispering Creek, Eleanor sat at her desk with a lamp positioned to cast her shadow against the curtains. The cabin door opened and closed at regular intervals as miners came to report daily progress, each time allowing watchers to glimpse her seated form inside. What observers couldn't see was that by the 5th such visit, it was no longer Eleanor sitting at the desk, but Rodrigo wearing her shawl and hat. Eleanor herself had slipped out through the cabin's back window, moving silently into the darkness that surrounded the mining camp. Years of tracking had honed her senses to interpret the night's subtle language. The absence of cricket song in a particular direction, the faint scuff of boot leather against stone, the barely perceptible shift in air currents as someone moved through the darkness. She became a shadow among shadows circling her own cabin with the patience of a predator. Near the edge of the camp, where the scrub brush grew thicker, she detected it, a presence that didn't belong, holding too still to be natural, radiating the particular tension of someone waiting to strike. Eleanor adjusted her path, circling behind the watcher with exquisite care. The figure was kneeling behind a large boulder rifle braced against its surface, aimed directly at her cabin. The moon emerged briefly from behind a cloud, illuminating the scene in silvery light, revealing not a company enforcer or hired assassin, but someone Eleanor knew well. "Sheriff Holden," she said softly, stepping from the shadows with her Colt trained on his back. "Or should I simply call you Daniel?" The rifle barrel dipped slightly as Holden froze, then slowly turned to face her. Something had changed in his features, the kindly sheriff's mask slipping to reveal harder lines beneath, like a landscape revealed after snowmelt. "Eleanor," he acknowledged, no surprise in his voice. "I wondered if you'd figure it out." "Not until Owen came back," she admitted, keeping her distance and her aim steady. But his death clarified certain inconsistencies. "Only a few people knew he was in my cabin that night. Fewer still would have both the motive and the shooting skill to silence him from that distance." Holden straightened, making no move toward the rifle that now lay across the boulder. "You were always smart. Samuel said that was what drew him to you first, not just beauty or even your hidden strength, but your mind." The casual mention of her husband from his killer's lips ignited a cold fury in Eleanor's chest. "Why?" she demanded. "Samuel trusted you, considered you a friend." "Adara, I was his friend." Holden insisted, a flash of genuine grief crossing his features. "That's what made it so damn difficult." "Difficult to murder him." The words emerged as ice-edged shards. Holden shook his head slowly. "To watch him throw everything away over some misguided principles. Do you have any idea what Pioneer offered him for this mine? $150,000, Eleanor? More money than most men see in 10 lifetimes." Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. "You were working for Pioneer all along." "Working with them," Holden corrected. "There's a difference. I've spent 25 years watching good men die poor in these mountains, breaking their bodies for gold that ends up in some banker's vault back east. Samuel had a chance to walk away wealthy to build a real future, but he wouldn't listen to reason. So you arranged his accident." Eleanor's finger tightened fractionally on the trigger. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way." Holden's voice carried a hint of desperate justification. "Owen was supposed to damage the beam enough to cause a minor collapse, scare Samuel into reconsidering Pioneer's offer. But when Samuel told me about the new vein he'd found, how he planned to register the claim officially the next day, you made sure he never left that shaft alive." Eleanor finished for him, the final pieces falling into place. "You adjusted his schedule, sent the other miners to different sections, giving Owen the opportunity to tamper with the beam. Then you covered it all up during your official investigation." Holden didn't deny it. "I did what I thought was necessary. The territory needs companies like Pioneer to bring stability infrastructure. Individual mines can't compete long-term. Samuel was fighting against the future." "Oh, that wasn't your decision to make." Eleanor's voice was soft but carried an edge sharper than any blade. "Not for Samuel, not for Whispering Creek, not for me." "What happens now, Eleanor?" Holden asked suddenly, looking every year of his age. "You kill me, add another body to the ghost tally, then what Pioneer will still come for the mine? Hayes has powerful friends in the territorial capital." "I'm not going to kill you, Daniel." Eleanor's decision crystallized as she spoke the words. "That would be too quick, too clean for what you've done. You're going to face justice, real justice. A trial for Samuel's murder, with every detail of your betrayal laid bare for all to see." Hope flickered across Holden's face, quickly replaced by resignation as he realized what such exposure would mean. In the frontier communities where a man's word was his bond, where friendship and loyalty were valued above almost everything else, the revelation of his treachery would be a sentence worse than death, a lifetime of being the man who betrayed his friend for money. Marshal Davis and his deputies should be arriving tomorrow. Eleanor continued. I sent for them specifically after Owen's death. Robert always had a particular interest in corruption among law enforcement. Amilanto. You've thought of everything, Holden said with bitter admiration. Not everything, Eleanor replied honestly. I never imagined it would be you, Daniel. Never wanted it to be you. A moment of silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the night-distant coyotes, the creak of wood from the mine structures, the whisper of wind through scrub brush. Then with the speed born of desperation, Holden lunged for his rifle. Eleanor's reaction was instant, not the killing shot she could have taken, but a carefully placed bullet that shattered his right shoulder, sending him sprawling backward with a cry of pain. The rifle clattered against stone, spinning away into the darkness. That was a warning, she stated, advancing to stand over him. The next one won't be. Blood soaked Holden's sleeve as he clutched his wounded shoulder, pain and defeat etched into the lines of his face. You've changed, Eleanor, he gasped. The woman who came to Whispering Creek 6 years ago would have put a bullet between my eyes without hesitation. You're right, she acknowledged. I have changed. Samuel changed me, showed me there could be justice without death strength, without cruelty. She kept her Colt trained on him as she spoke. But don't mistake mercy for weakness, Daniel. I'm still the woman who tracked killers across 3 territories. I'm still the woman who never lost her prey. Relief flooded her as she heard footsteps approaching Rodrigo, and Garrett, alerted by the gunshot, moving swiftly through the darkness with lanterns and weapons. The difference, Eleanor continued as their light spilled across the scene, illuminating Holden's fallen form, is that now I'm also the woman who knows when not to kill, and that's a far more difficult lesson than learning when to pull the trigger. Marshal Robert Davis arrived the following afternoon with 4 deputies, his imposing figure barely altered from Eleanor's memories of their time working together 7 years earlier. His iron-gray hair and carefully trimmed mustache did little to soften his commanding presence as he surveyed the scene at Whispering Creek Mine. Sheriff Holden, his wounded shoulder bandaged and his hands bound, sat slumped in a chair outside the assay office under the watchful eye of 2 deputies. The evidence against him had proven irrefutable. Owen Jenkins's final confession, corroborated by records discovered in Holden's home detailing payments from Pioneer Gold spanning 3 years, and most damning of all, the sheriff's own admission once he realized the extent of Eleanor's proof. You've done good work here, Eleanor, Davis observed as they stood at the entrance to the lower shaft, watching miners bringing up ore samples that glittered richly in the afternoon sun. Though I can't say I'm surprised. You were always thorough, even back when we rode together. Different circumstances require different methods, she replied, studying her former colleague with cautious respect. Their parting 7 years earlier had been professional, but strained Davis, unable to fully understand her decision to abandon bounty hunting at the height of her reputation. Different methods, perhaps, but the same dedication to justice. Davis's weathered face creased in a rare smile. Samuel would be proud. The mention of her husband's name brought a momentary pang, though no longer the sharp agony that had characterized her grief for so long. I hope so. What happens now? Davis asked, gesturing toward the bustling activity of the mine. Pioneer won't give up easily despite Holden's exposure. Hayes has already sent telegrams to his attorneys in Denver. Let them come, Eleanor said with quiet confidence. Whispering Creek is on solid legal ground. The claim is properly registered, the boundaries clearly marked. Samuel's documentation was impeccable. And its owner, Davis studied her with open curiosity. Where does she go from here? The Ghost Reborn or Eleanor Sawyer continued. The question gave her pause. The events of the past weeks had forced her to reconcile the 2 halves of herself that she had kept so rigidly separated, the deadly efficient bounty hunter and the respectable widow. Neither identity alone seemed sufficient now. Neither, I think, she answered finally. Something new, something that honors both paths without being limited by either. Davis nodded, understanding in his eyes. The territory could use someone with your particular combination of skills, Eleanor. Someone who understands both sides of justice, its official face, and its shadow workings. Are you offering me a job, Robert? More like a partnership, he clarified. special investigator for the Territorial Marshal's Office operating with autonomy but official backing. There are cases that require unconventional approaches, corruption that hides behind respectability, crimes that cross boundaries of law and society. Eleanor considered the proposal, finding it unexpectedly appealing. I have responsibilities here, she said, gesturing toward the mine. Samuel's legacy needs protection. Chiwi. The position wouldn't require you to abandon Whispering Creek, Davis assured her. In fact, having a legitimate business as cover would be advantageous. You could manage the mine while taking on cases that warrant your particular attention. A way to honor both parts of herself, to use the skills of the ghost in service of the values Eleanor Sawyer had come to cherish. It offered a path forward that didn't require bearing either aspect of her identity. I'll consider it, she promised, neither accepting nor refusing outright. As Davis departed with his deputies and their prisoner, Eleanor stood on the porch of her cabin, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. The mining camp hummed with purposeful activity, men moving between structures, the rhythmic sounds of machinery from the lower shaft, Mrs. Wilson calling workers to the evening meal. Inside the cabin, spread across her desk, lay Samuel's journals and maps, his vision for Whispering Creek preserved in careful diagrams and precise calculations. Beside them rested a small wooden box she had found hidden in a niche near where he died. Its contents finally revealed a detailed rendering of the gold vein he'd discovered, samples that proved its worth, and a letter addressed to her in his familiar handwriting. My dearest Eleanor. He had written in what must have been his final hours, perhaps sensing the danger closing around him. If you're reading this, something has prevented me from sharing this discovery with you in person. Trust no one until you understand what happened. The gold is real, more valuable than anyone suspects, but it's also dangerous. Men will kill for less. The letter continued with technical details about the vein, recommendations for extraction, careful instructions for legal protection of the claim. But it was the final paragraph that Eleanor had read repeatedly until the words were etched in her memory. Whatever comes, remember that your past made you who you are, all of it, even the parts you wish to forget. I fell in love with the whole woman, not just the parts you chose to show the world. If I'm gone, live fully as yourself, not as the ghost, not as Mrs. Sawyer, but as Eleanor, the remarkable woman I was blessed to call my wife. She folded the letter carefully, returning it to its box. Samuel had known her completely, had seen the darkness and the light together, and loved both. He had offered her not just a new identity, but the freedom to integrate all that she had been into what she might become. Eleanor picked up the small tin star that had once marked her as a hunter of men. For years it had remained hidden in her trunk, a relic of a life abandoned. Now as she turned it in the fading light, it seemed less a symbol of death and more a reminder of justice, imperfect, difficult, but necessary. The decision formed with quiet certainty. She would accept Davis's offer, but on her own terms. Whispering Creek would flourish as Samuel had envisioned, a model of fair practices and shared prosperity. And Eleanor Sawyer, once known as the Ghost, would continue to hunt not for bounties, but for truth for those who could not fight for themselves. She stepped from the porch into the yard where Rodrigo was supervising the evening shift change. I need you to send a telegram to Marshal Davis, she told him. Tell him I accept his proposal with conditions we'll discuss when he returns. You're taking the position? Rodrigo asked, not entirely surprised. I'm creating a new one, Eleanor corrected with the first genuine smile he had seen from her in years. One that uses everything I am, not just the parts that fit neatly into someone else's expectations. As twilight deepened into night, Eleanor stood on the ridge overlooking Whispering Creek Mine. Below, lamps illuminated the bustle of the evening shift men, moving with renewed purpose now that the mine's future seemed secure. The whisper of wind through pine branches carried the promise of approaching autumn, of change and renewal. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing the final silver bullet she had kept from her days as a bounty hunter. It gleamed in the moonlight, a reminder of deaths delivered and justice served at a terrible cost. With deliberate movements, she placed it in the small wooden box alongside Samuel's letter, then buried the box at the base of a lightning-scarred pine that overlooked the mine. It seemed fitting somehow, the last remnant of the ghost laid to rest beside the words of the man who had helped her find a different path. Not buried in shame or denial, but preserved as acknowledgement of a journey completed and a new one beginning. Eleanor Sawyer, widow, mine owner, former bounty hunter, And now something entirely her own creation descended the ridge toward the lights of the camp below. She wore a gun at her hip, not to bring death, but to protect what mattered. The shadows that had once been her hiding place now merely walked alongside her, acknowledged companions, rather than consuming darkness. Whispering Creek had found new life in the heart of its mountain, just as she had found new purpose in the integration of her divided self. The ghost had not vanished, but had instead found substance and meaning beyond vengeance and death. In the distance, a coyote called a lonesome sound that echoed across the valley before fading into silence. Eleanor paused, listening as the night absorbed the cry, then continued her descent toward home. The revenant had completed her reckoning. Justice had been served, and in the aftermath of violence and revelation, something unexpected had emerged, not peace exactly, but a kind of harmony between the woman she had been and the one she was becoming. In the end, that was Samuel's true legacy, not gold or property, but the freedom to be fully herself in a world that demanded simplicity from complex souls. It was enough. It was everything. The dust settles differently after justice has been served. It carries the weight of what was revealed, what was avenged, and what can never be reclaimed. Eleanor Sawyer buried more than a silver bullet beneath that lightning-scarred pine. She laid to rest the clean divisions between who she was and who she'd become. The bounty hunter's precision merged with the widow's resilience. The avenger's determination tempered by the lover's compassion. Some would call it a victory. The murderer exposed the conspiracy, unraveled the gold vein secured. Samuel's legacy protected. But victory carries a particular silence in these mountains, one that echoes with the cost of every bullet fired and every truth unearthed. Perhaps true strength lies not in becoming someone new, but in embracing all that we have been, in allowing our ghosts to walk beside us rather than haunt our shadows, in understanding that the most dangerous predator is one who has learned when not to kill. As night falls over Whispering Creek, the mind whispers its secrets to those willing to listen, of veins that run deep, of hearts that endure, of reckonings that change us, and of revenants who, having settled their debts, find something unexpected in the aftermath of vengeance, a way forward.